Nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies were stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. All right, we are back with Dr. Bikrum Gil. Today's myth being that Iran is an evil imperialist regime, and this is based out of some of what we talked about in the prior episode with Dr. Bikrum Gil, who's a professor in political science and political ecology, and who's a professor in political science, and is just does a master class of breaking down world systems theory and political economy more broadly, and was someone who would be excellent for this topic. So this plays off of what he was on here for last time when around the time that the war against Iran first started. He came on to debunk this myth of when people say they stand with the Iranian people, but so there's like, or we stand with the people of Iran, but so there's always this kind of like, but their government's tyrannical or the government's evil. Like people always got to get that shot in, or so we don't stand with that government. We don't stand with the United States. We stand with the people. And it sounds good on its face. I'm not going to rehash it. The link to that show will be in the myth, or the link to that show will be in the show notes. But generally it's just like that it becomes a position that actually enables imperialism, as we lay out, as opposed to something that that can carve out this perfect space of moralism that I think people are looking for, and it ends up siding with it. In this case, we look more so at like we've talked about many times in the show, what imperialism is, but it's a slightly different question: what constitutes an imperialist country? And Bikram goes into great length to really break down the science of how we should understand that materially, right? What are the actual qualifiers for it? How does the system around us, around this world, under capitalism and imperialism work? And how does a country that's seeking to get its own sovereignty fit within that, as opposed to us taking this position because we are just fans of Iran or hate Iran? Like we're not really trying to break it down like that. It's important to note though that this conversation was somewhat inspired, even though we don't really get into it to the second hour of this conversation, by this letter that came out in The Guardian called "To Iran's Political Prisoners Trapped Between Two Blades of Scissors." It's this open letter, has many prominent academics from Angela Davis to Robyn Kelley to Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor to Dan Berger and several others, Judith Butler. It's caused a major outrage for those of us who spend too much time, in my opinion, online. But understandably so, because it's taking this position again. We stand with the Iranian prisoners, but it's like somehow finding this thing where all Iran's just as equally bad as Israel and the United States and all of that. So some people have already withdrawn their name from it, etc. There's already been, for those who probably listen to shows like this, there's already been a lot of conversations on it. So I'm sure many people are already aware, but if you're not, it'll be in the show notes as well. So this, I think, sparked a deeper conversation than just condemning the letter or something, which I think many people have done quite well, but more so like thinking about the knowledge production out here that produces these kind of logics that leads us to mislabeling a country as imperialist, to not really understanding imperialist, to reducing it to just things that are repressive or mean or whatever, and how this ultimately just helps helps imperialism. It helps the West, it helps the United States. It does not aid in the cause of the people we claim we're trying to protect, right? So condemning the Iranian government is not really helping the people of Iran. It's not really helping the political prisoners in a moment where there's a fucking war going on. So gonna get into it. Do want to shout out the patrons. I had a really great amount of people come through. I forgot to do this on the last episode, so I just want to make sure we shout y'all out. There was Rochelle Watty, there was Dana Lopez, there was Selah Bukram Lebre, there was Tiffany McCoy, there was XF, there was Sheila Capper Finn, there was Antoine Kohler, there was Lizzie, there was Anita Shakartor, there was Sam, and there was Anna. So great outpouring of support. We did a thing where we put the we had a 2 hour episode. We chopped it into two different episodes. This time we're just dropping this straight up. But there'll be more content, especially this upcoming month, because we're probably not gonna do as many podcasts in September because there's some writing I need to get done. But for those who are on Patreon, I will be doing episodes on there. So please check that out. They won't be as involved, but it'll be stuff that the audience can interact with and such. And then we'll be back for regular episodes in October. There'll be something that drops next month because we're working on something this week, but probably won't be as many as there's been this month. So definitely want to shout out everybody. But other than that, let's get into the episode. All right, all right. Welcome back. Welcome back, Dr. Bikrum Gil. Um, our episode last time did pretty well, and we pissed off the internet and got got a viral video out of it.
Yeah.
And I think I listened back to it. I appreciated it that we didn't get into the predictive, game of the war. It's important to talk about it, but it holds up more, especially in this moment, as opposed to us just trying to make these poly market predictions about what was going to happen.
Hmm.
Even if Iran, I think it pretty clearly is winning, but the conditions are always evolving. Um, so today we're back to talk about Iran, the myth being that Iran is an evil imperialist regime. This is something that gets thrown around, as we'll get to later, even by people that I guess would be considered on our side loosely, the so-called left or whatever people are describing it as. Um, so you will get to it, but we get these positions of, you know, I like we did in our first episode, I support the Iranian people, but right, but the government is terrible. And we walk through a lot of why that logic is flawed and why that ultimately ends up siding with imperialism, even if that's not your intention. Um, so I would refer people again to go back and listen to that. This episode it's a little bit more open, but we want to really understand at first like why Iran's not imperialist, not from just this kind of moralistic sense because we want to defend them because we like them or not, but like really coming to an understanding materially as to what constitutes imperialism and what constitutes an imperialist country. Um, and then we'll get into um, some of these sideshow things that have happened over the last week, but also the deeper politics that emanates from that. So, first question. First, what makes a country imperialist, right? That we see different, recognitions of it. If it's military posture, if they invaded a country, or if they are hostile on a border, is it the way they treat their own citizens? Iran gets accused often of repression. Is it doing business with other countries and having uneven trade relationships? Is the label is thrown out in all these different ways, but what constitutes or what conditions constitute an imperialist nation? Like what really materially makes a country imperialist?
Yeah. So I think I think that it's good the way you phrase the question because something like a state's military posture, the way they treat their citizens, trade with other countries. Now, those can be attached to imperialism. So it's not that those are not important, but they're not in and of themselves definitive of imperialism. I think that's where we want to get to. What is the definitive quality of imperialism? And then we can assess how a state's military posture does or does not advance imperialism or anti-imperialism. First, like what is it exactly? So, the basic definition again is imperialism is when one country or political community, if it's not a state as we see it today, some form of political community is exercising power or control over another one. Okay. Now, what this effectively means is one state or political entity is constraining the sovereignty of another. Now, what does it mean to constrain its sovereignty? It means that the imperialist force has usurped, it's taken the sovereignty away. And that means it's taken decision-making power away. Okay, so it's taken decision-making power away from another political entity over a clearly delineated territory. Okay, so it's taken decision-making power away. And what does that mean, decision-making power? It means the ultimate authority over the use of resources within that territory. What are resources and people's energies and labor being organized in service of? Okay, so now in a sovereign setting, you would ideally recycle your own energy and of your people and your land, etc., in service of the meaning that is attached to your faith or your people or that history there. There's something about what you're producing qualitatively. Okay, so this is something that imperialism usurps. It takes that power to recycle resources and energy, and instead of it servicing the meaning attached to your identity, the meaning attached to your history, to your faith, etc., to your place on this planet, it services the imperial power. Okay, now it's taken sovereignty, it's taken decision-making power, and it utilizes that in service of the imperial entity. Now, that can, so like, when I mentioned this, it's going to matter. When I mentioned this quality of sovereignty, right? So there's like a hard power of sovereignty, right? But there's a quality of why you exercise authority over territory to reproduce what? Some sort of meaning in life, right? Now that quality can also be taken hold of by an imperial power. You can have a religious authority that's local to a territory that then gets appropriated by the imperial power. But it's regardless, the definition of imperialism here is you're usurping sovereignty over territory, over resources, even over culture, and you're reorienting it in service of the imperial core. Now, there is a distinction I want to make that I often make between colonialism and imperialism. Okay, so this is going to be important. So again, colonialism is when you usurp sovereignty over a territory on a territorial basis, whereas imperialism is the denial of sovereignty over the flow of capital between territories, over the flow of core commodities and goods between territories. Now, this is very important. So what imperialism tends towards is a systematic relationship. You can have, as I've mentioned many times, you can have France colonizing Algeria, but an imperialism is a system in which you have a core, an imperialist core that systematically denies sovereignty over the entry and exit of capital and resources to a periphery, which is not just one state, but a series of states that can have that sort of power imposed on them in a range of ways.
So
it could be through.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So would you say in those definitions, so imperialism can't be a one-to-one thing? Or
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that this is something I would want people to hold on to, and I think it'll be clear I'm going to have a very brief discussion right now on how this has actually looked concretely, right? But I think imperialism has always been systematic. So you can have multiple colonial powers existing in a world system, and we have, right? Like you can have France and Britain and Germany. There's multiple colonialisms here. There can be multiple imperialisms too, right? Like France can have multiple colonies. When you put those all together, you might have a French imperial system. Now so the British imperial system, so it's systematic, okay? And there can be a range of mechanisms, currency power, financial power, military power, through which different parts of the periphery are denied sovereign control over the entry and exit of capital. And that is basically, though, the aim is you impose conditions of dependency on your periphery because you're able to control the entry and exit of capital. And you do so again, remember, you do so again in order to feed those resources into your territory. So now this is a key part of the definition, the denial of sovereignty through the use of force, military and economic, the denial of sovereignty over the flow of capital into and out of a territory on a systemic basis. That is definitive of imperialist power. Now, the imperialism we talk about today is capitalist imperialism. Okay, capitalism on a systemic scale requires imperialism. Okay, because the contradictions of capitalism would not allow for endless growth otherwise. If you have a dispossessed laboring class, okay, you have workers who have no means of reproducing their lives outside of the market. Therefore, the capitalist represses the wages to draw a surplus out of it, but then the capitalist limits its market. Now it has nowhere to sell its goods, right? But it can overcome that contradiction through imperialism, because imperialism provisions you through that use of force, and by imposing dependency, then you impose a price setting power on the periphery, and you draw out very cheap goods below the cost of their reproduction, which is why you will have the maybe genocidal policies in the periphery, right? Actually using up an elimination of life. You're not trying to reproduce the life in the periphery, right? So capitalist imperialism requires a consistent access to cheap goods from the peripheries and even captive markets in the peripheries, right? This is a structural requirement of capitalism. But the way it's proceeded historically, and this is going to get to your question on the systemic nature of imperialism, the way this is proceeded historically is, the capitalist core has historically been, for reasons I won't get into now, but it's historically been in Europe, okay? And you've had multiple capitalist states developing in Europe that have required this periphery we just spoke about, okay? Now, within that core of capitalist countries, there's always been a singular imperialist hegemon. Now, what defines this singular imperialist hegemon? It is that country that has established superior military power vis-a-vis the other capitalist countries. It's that country that's established superior, even economic productive power in terms of it might economically outcompete the other countries. Like say the way Great Britain becomes the workshop of the world in the 19th century, right? So there's a military power, there's an economic power through which one of those core capitalist countries is going to establish itself as an indispensable force that secures that flow of cheap goods from the periphery to the core, if that makes sense. So it's the British Navy that's the dominant naval power that will ensure that even Germany, even France, they will have access to a consistent supply of goods from the colonies, right? It's the British that ensure this. This is what determines the hegemon in the imperialist system. Now, this also then gives the hegemon other public goods it's able to provide other capitalist countries, like an international currency. So you have the British pound sterling or the US dollar. This is very important, even for the competing capitalist states, to facilitate trade between those countries, right? Now, it gives the imperialist country a power over the other capitalist countries. It does, that currency hegemony, okay? They also provide other public goods, like they'll provide maybe access to their market. They'll develop a larger market. So Germany can export to Britain, or they can export to the United States, right? So there is a way in which a hegemon emerges, an imperialist hegemon. But what's key for that hegemon is that it is the major power over the periphery, if that makes sense. So it's not like France and Germany doesn't have colonies, but it's Great Britain that's the major imperial power. That gives its hegemony over Europe. And then Great Britain will exercise the balance of power on the continent. It has control over the balance of power, the lever of the balance of power. Because, European states, they're able to balance off one another. They don't fight each other. They don't go to war, right? Because of the imperial subsidy, right? Great Britain can take in imports on a massive scale because they can offset that deficit by draining wealth from India and China, right? So this is the world system, and it's moved through cycles. You'll have an imperialist hegemon that facilitates development for the entire capitalist core by draining wealth from the periphery and controlling access over trade routes, right? But at a certain point in time, a crisis emerges in the accumulation and development process when other capitalist states develop too far and they start to then that balance
states that are not the hegemon.
Yeah. Like say Germany will start competing with Great Britain because now that setup no longer works for Germany, right? Germany now is producing too much capital and they need actually colonies to which to export that capital because they might be outcompeting Great Britain now in say the production of steel or something, right? But they have nowhere to realize value out of that steel because Great Britain can say build or iron, they can build railways in Kenya, or they can lay down things somewhere and they can generate more value out of that export. So at a certain point in time, Germany or one of these capitalist powers will seek to increase their share of access to the imperialist surplus and the control over it, especially, right? And this is what historically has led to inter-imperialist wars. Okay, is let's think about two key historical examples. The two key examples in the history of the capitalist world system. France and Great Britain fight each other in the 18th century, right? The before the so-called Revolutionary War, which is actually counter-revolutionary war.
Right.
You have a 7 Years' War, right? Where France and Great, and they're basically effectively fighting to see who will succeed the Dutch as the imperialist hegemon.
Mhm.
Okay. Later on, you have World War I and World War II, which, like Lenin and others, basically demonstrated this is inter-imperialist war, right? This is when the Kaiser says Germany wants its place under the sun, right? What are they saying? The British Empire never sets. The sun never sets on the. What is he actually calling for, right? So there's a point in time where this switch happens, where the imperialist power can no longer sustain itself vis-a-vis its other capitalist rivals, and war and conflict can break out, and then a successor imperialist hegemon, right, that can reorganize the system, right, that can reorganize the system, that can re-secure access to imperial surplus from the peripheries. Yeah. So that's like Great Britain after the Dutch. That's like the United States defeats Germany and Japan as the other contenders. And it constructs a new system post-World War II that reproduces the systematic denial of sovereignty to states on the periphery. Okay. So the United States then, from the 1970s, it'll enter a crisis. It is, Samir Amin will say post-World War II, inter-imperialism gives way to collective imperialism. That now they're not fighting each other, the US, the EU, and Japan, it's a triad. It's collective imperialism. In fact, this is US imperialism, right? Like we know now, it's very clear, Europe is not really even independent, actually, in a meaningful way.
Yeah,
Neither is
especially not
Japan.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, they even so they benefited from the spoils of US control over the flow of capital, of US imposing dependency on the periphery. This was beneficial to capitalist development, right? But again, that same dynamic emerges in the 1970s, right? You have this increasing intercapitalist competition between the United States, Germany, and Japan again in the 1970s, right? This leads to a crisis of accumulation that the United States overcomes, and I talked about this on your program last time, and I've talked about this, they overcome this again, right, by projecting power in West Asia, by establishing control over oil, by backstopping their dollar in this way, right? So they're able to then structural adjustment comes. So whatever the crisis of accumulation that happens in the 1970s, the United States is able to then reconfigure the world system to renew the drain of surplus, to overcome this crisis of competition. Because another part,
there was the
sorry, go
Volcker,
ahead.
there was the Volcker shocks too with the Fed.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. I mean, it's about the Volcker shock, but effectively, like part of the crisis of accumulation in the 1970s is decolonization has happened.
Yeah.
And you cannot subsidize capitalist development in the same way. So you need to kind of recolonize the South as one way out of this intensifying competition between the US, Germany, and Japan. You have an overaccumulated capital with nowhere to go. So you can now send it to the South by forcing decolonized states to open their economies. And you do so by the power of the dollar Wall Street regime, which is backed by the US military, and then by initiating this Volcker shock, which quadruples interest rates, sends the global South, not all though, right? We have to remember there were global South states, particularly China, that took a very different road at this time. So it basically reopens the global South to an intensification of a wealth drain that can subsidize capitalist development in the core, right? This is basically a brief history and unfolding of imperialism and what defines an imperialist state, right? It is that state that systematically denies sovereignty to the periphery through military and economic force in order to subsidize capitalist development in the core, right? Now, look at where we are in this historical moment. The US is clearly entering into terminal decline. Now, I don't mean that to say that in 5 years, or 10 years. I'm just saying, in the long sweep of history, the United States is not on the rise in
Yeah.
terms of its imperial power. It's clearly on the decline. Okay. Its ability to impose itself on a China economically, the evidence speaks for itself. Okay. Even if it does so in Venezuela, even if it does so in pockets, right? Systematically, it's not able to do so to the level it would have before. Um, Now, militarily, we're seeing that with Iran. Now, it may look then, based on the discussion we've had, it may look to people as they're observing this, well, does this mean then what we're having with the United States and China and Iran, let's say, is this a new inter-imperialist war? Right? Are we looking at a replay of this? Okay, so the United States, but that's a mistake, okay? Because you did not have Iran as part of the capitalist core. China was not part of the capitalist core. They were on the periphery. So their projects are not capitalist states, right, that are challenging the control over the imperialist surplus, right? They are states from the periphery whose objective is to reclaim sovereignty over the flow
Right.
of capital. Their objective is not to become imperialist. Their objective is to secure their own sovereignty. That is their primary objective, but they are realizing to do so, they have to transform the whole world system. So that is an important distinction because Iran and China are not structured on the same foundations as the United States or other capitalist states in the core. And the foundation I'm talking about is they're not structured on a universal dispossession of the proletariat. They're not structured on settler colonial land theft and histories of enslavement in the way that Western capitalist states are, right? So that structural foundation means that it is not structural for them to require an imperialist surplus trade. But what is structural for them, right, for them to secure their sovereignty and continue to develop is to overcome the control that imperialism exercises, right, over the flow of capital into and out of their territory. And so it may look like we are re-entering an inter-imperialist war moment, but in fact, we are in a novel historical moment. We've never encountered, and maybe this is why there's a lot of confusion. We've never encountered a historical moment when the definitive war at the scale of world order is between imperialism and anti-imperialism, not between inter-imperialist powers. We've not had this. So the structure of world order is changing right now. But it's not changing between British and American imperialism. It's not a new US imperialism is laying down a new foundation of imperialism. The structure of world order is now between a fight between imperialism and anti-imperialism, right? Between an imperialist order that reproduce. This is something I forgot to mention, but imperialism also in denying sovereignty, it inherently reproduces a dynamic of development at one pole and underdevelopment at the other. You don't see that in China and Iran's relations. Iran's relations in West Asia, you see nowhere a dynamic of development and underdevelopment. And same with China's relations with global South states. Nowhere can we find this, right? Instead, what the Belt and Road or the axis of resistance put forward is a framework of sovereign equality, right? A framework of mutuality in national liberation in West Asia, right? So I think it may look similar, but in fact, we are in an unfamiliar ground right now. And maybe that's some of the difficulty people are having with the moment we're in.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a class in and of itself, in terms of that breakdown. A few things want to pick at there just to maybe flesh them out more. So I think sometimes the understanding, I think people pull from Lenin, I don't have the definition directly in front of me, but is this idea that you kind of got at it, is that there's an overaccumulation, and then that money needs to be pushed, externally outward. So sometimes people will read, I don't want to make this episode about China, but sometimes people will read that China well, some people even claim China has an overproduction problem. Therefore need to offload that elsewhere, and then that gets read as imperialism. Iran is different because this is why the imperialist argument for Iran is even funnier, because they're under so many sanctions, they don't even really have the ability to do that anyway.
Mhm.
But we'll get to that. But I'm saying,
Yeah.
but sometimes there's a confusion that or you can just clarify if it is a confusion. I'm just asking the question where, since China is offloading this production and therefore their capital to, say, the Congo, and the Congo people are dying, producing diamonds and producing all these materials that go into our phones and the batteries and things of that nature. The people then will call that imperialist, or people will call their relationships with, you know, other countries throughout the continent, particularly imperialist, because they'll say it reproduces the same kind of inequality that already exists in those societies. So, just more so we can understand what makes a nation imperialist. I'm asking that not to get into a China conversation, but just more
Yeah, yeah.
so as an example to understand how we're framing imperialism here.
So that's very good. And I would start by just going back to Lenin. Okay, so we have to remember that, and this goes back to the way you framed the first question. Okay, the export of capital is a necessary condition for imperialism, but not a sufficient one on its own. Right. So we got to remember in Lenin's his pamphlet, or whatever you want to call it, it's that short book on imperialism. Like,
Mhm.
there's five conditions that he lays down that have to be satisfied. Now, the export of capital is one, right? The export of capital has to be undertaken under the hegemony of bank and finance capital. So China is not a state where bank and finance capital have hegemony. The Communist Party does.
Mhm.
So export of capital is not inherently in and of itself a bad thing. Why would we assume, right, that if in an ideal world, if one state has an excess of productive capital in one way, that it can't be put to better use somewhere else, right? That's not necessarily inherently flawed. If now the purpose of that export of capital, if the purpose is to de-develop or underdevelop that territory, right, to lock in basically the necessity of draining from their cheap wage goods, right? To again subsidize that capitalist contradiction, then you would have this development underdevelopment dynamic reproduce itself inherently. But China doesn't need that because China subsidizes its labor in other ways, right? China has universal access to land in its country. That's the opposite of the structural foundation of Western capitalist states, right? So that's, I think, a big first point. A second point is, now you can interrogate it and say this is just a claim that China makes. It's not practice, but I think I stand to be corrected, but I think the studies overwhelmingly show the Belt and Road is a project that has as its aim not the concentration of value in China, but the distribution of value throughout the Belt and Road. And this is something that it understands is necessary for Chinese development. So you see, it's like approaching its own development project as understanding the development of the Congo or the development in Southeast Asia or elsewhere on the African continent is an important component of the development of China independent of Western control. So it is directed not by a financial capitalist class seeking quick returns. It is directed by a communist party that seeks to prioritize state-to-state relations of mutual development, right? That can sustain the construction of alternative economic architecture. And I think, like you were saying, materially, we can just observe that you can't find this wealth drain. You don't see a systematic underdevelopment of the Congo in relation to China in the way you see with European or Western firms.
Right, and China didn't put neocolonialism in place in the first. Even when China is going to go to these governments, the kind of neocolonial model that Europe reinstituted, like you said earlier, China is forced to interact with that. So the inequality that exists in those societies isn't necessarily a product of China exporting more
No,
capital. It's the kind of it's the neocolonial leaders that are, going to hold that money and not share it on their own, right? And there's not much they can do with that with their non-interventionist approach either.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, you're right. And I think, but I will say, like as an example, so like because of the context you framed, like Chinese firms can participate in the same sort of activities for which we criticize
Yeah.
Western firms. You will see it, but then like there was a case in the Congo, I think last almost 10 years ago in the late 2010s, right? Where I think maybe a half a dozen Chinese firms, or a few anyways, were, I think, violating local labor or environmental laws or something, right? Like, uh, and China actually worked with the government to expel those firms, so they brought a disciplinary power to bear. You had a similar thing happen in Zambia earlier in that decade, right? So I think you're right. Like there's a world systemic structure into which China is entering. It cannot provision global South states, right? It cannot provision them with an economic program. Those have to come from those states themselves.
Yeah.
And they are operating in a system that is already neo-colonial. But I think China is then opening up alternative options for them for finance, for trade, et cetera, that are not attached to the conditions that lead to underdevelopment that are imposed by the IMF and the World Bank. I think that's a very key difference. So any state can say to China, okay, so we want investment, and China's not going to say, okay, we're going to give it to you on XYZ conditions. They're not going to ask for privatization. They're not going to ask for the whole suite of economic reforms.
Yeah, they're more likely to do kind of what they were doing in Iran, where oil's being sold for cheap, in exchange for China coming in and doing projects in the country or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, okay, back to Iran, because I could go. The China question is always interesting, but
Yeah.
to get back to Iran and within this framework of imperialism that you've laid out, how does a country like Iran then become historically labeled as imperialist? Because it seems, based on what you're saying, that even if you have a cursory understanding of Iran since even the revolution, they were almost immediately, as we talked about in the last episode, they were almost immediately at war once they, seized power with Iraq, and that went until what, like 88 or something like that.
Yeah.
And then by the 90s, really even before, they were already under some sanctions, but the sanctions start tightening in the 90s. So their ability to even, if they even wanted to, their ability to project that kind of power seems like it would be limited. Yet and still, they are labeled imperialists by some, repressive. I think I understand that, because there are contradictions there. But but even when being labeled repressive, as if all governments don't have a form of repression. Even when you label it repressive, that becomes a marker of imperialism as opposed to just a contradiction of the government. So but what is it that leads people, for those who have no sense of this conversation, to even labeling Iran imperialist? Like, what are the qualifiers for such a thing?
So, okay, I'm going to be very specific to begin with. Okay. So I think there's a bigger reason that's not just unique to Iran. Okay. And then there's a more specific reason where people misread Iran. Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll start with the bigger reason though first though. So like in the history of this imperialist capitalist world system, I just very briefly sketched out for folks, right? You have basically had a system of international law that's attached itself to this system, right? And this system of international law, which is, or the international order, which has its roots in the 16th century colonization of the Americas and the Westphalian system, et cetera, right? It has consistently given the imperial powers the right to basically attack states in the periphery at the moment they challenge the denial of sovereignty. So, until you do that, you're fine. Frantz Fanon and Walter Rodney are very clear about this. They'll let you dance. They'll even give you raises sometimes, maybe some better prices here and there, but you should never challenge their authority to determine the price, their authority to determine the use of the resource. They'll give you a lot underneath that, right? So when you violate that, which Iran has done, you become outside of law, right? You become subject to any amount of violence, but you also become subject to an ideological propaganda war of delegitimization. That then, and this is what I'm going to say, I know we're going to get into a discussion of this wonderful letter briefly, right? But what I will say is like, this is where people in the West have to be really careful, right? Because, the vilification of a project, a state, a movement from the periphery, right, that challenges the sovereignty question. It gets placed outside of law, and then it gets subjected to an ideological propaganda war that then gives even left forces in the West a way to legitimize themselves. So if you're sitting in the West and you're saying Black Lives Matter, or you're saying something about workers' rights or some left issue, right? And then you attach that to a demonization of, say, North Korea, or a demonization, you're going to legitimize yourself further. You're going to get
Mm,
yourself access to
mm,
political capital, right? Because in the end, the imperial system can give some space to anti-racism, right? We know they can take it away. We see that, right? Like
yeah,
I'm
we're
not. It's
living
not like
through. Yeah.
they don't actually believe it, but they can give some space to
Mm,
stabilize their system. But just like the stabilization of the capital labor relation requires this imperialist wealth drain, the stabilization of race relations, of gender relations, can also happen on top of the imperial subsidy, right?
mm,
So this is where the left here needs to be very careful, because you can get conscripted into this, right? Because if you don't follow this, then you're not going to get hired for a job.
yeah,
You're not going to be paid $500,000 a year at UCLA or wherever some of these signatories are working, however much money they're making, right? You are not going to get access to those if you systematically stand with the challengers to imperialism. So Iran has done this. Iran then is subject to arrange, let's say, a constrained place in the political spectrum in the West. You know, for you again to be acceptable in advancing your particular political aims, whatever they may be, labor, race, gender, requires you to reproduce this villainization. And that means Iran can be only one of certain things. It can be authoritarian. Take your pick. Is it authoritarian? Is it repressive? Is it imperialist, right? Like you have, so there's this range of options that are there. And that gets applied to states. Now, why does Iran get identified as an imperialist? So this is really not interesting, but it's troubling because I even saw some of the responses to this letter. For example, I saw Vijay Prashad wrote this essay. And even in there, he reproduces actually a really flawed understanding of Iran's approach to the West Asian region, which is how people then will read Iran as imperialist. And what I mean by this is they'll understand that Iran, okay, after the revolution, intervenes into the West Asian region. Yeah, they do something that even so-called objective military analysts in the West, what they'll say is Iran comes up with what they call a forward defense strategy. Okay. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, we have to protect ourselves against the United States and Israel and other hostile states, right? Because Iran is an expansionary revolutionary state. And of course, the Western analysts will represent this as a very negative thing because they're exporting a theocratic, exclusionary model, right? And
right,
so now Iran then comes up with a strategy that they'll say is forward defense, which is like, okay, so you're going to then say, we're going to have a proxy in Lebanon. We're going to have a proxy in Yemen. We'll have a proxy in Iraq, a proxy in Palestine. And that way the fight never comes to us. Now that, if you read it in that way, it can suggest maybe not a capitalist imperialism, but maybe a more classical, older imperialism,
right,
right? Where Iran is containing the sovereignty of other states in order to enhance its own narrow interests, right? But that's a misreading of the axis of resistance. It was not a forward defense strategy. This is incorrect.
is this
Uh,
what Rashad put in the
yeah,
piece?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
He. I don't know if this is what he is. It's just maybe he moved through it too quickly in the piece, but I'm just flagging it because in the response, I think to this, we don't want to reproduce the conditions that misread how Iran moves in the region, right? So Iran doesn't engage in a forward defense strategy. What you have is an axis of resistance that emerges, which is a convergence of multiple national liberation projects in the region. It's not Iran creating a national liberation movement in Lebanon. It's the occupation that creates this, right? It's
Right,
not Iran that creates resistance in Iraq. It's the occupation that creates this. It's not Iran that creates opposition to Saudi encroachment and invasion for decades in Yemen, right? It's the Saudis acting as a projection of power of US imperialism that creates those national liberation responses. What Iran does, because it is a singular project that captures state power, so immense resources, right, that has a deep also theological basis that we'll talk about, it's able to organize that axis or provide an organizational space and a material set of resources so those different liberation movements can move on a singular axis. Because what we know is no, when we say no one is free until everyone is free, that matters in the region, right? Like the sovereignty of one is impossible without the sovereignty of all. And imperialism functions regionally by balkanizing a region. So Iran has helped to unify the region on an anti-imperialist footing, but it doesn't create a forward defense strategy. That is not what Iran has done. It has worked in deep solidaristic relations, right? So I think there's like a bigger strategic historical reason why there's like a range of options that Iran is placed on for us to apprehend, right? Um, whereas there's a smaller set of tactical issues we can see too, a misreading of Iran's movement in the region, right? That it wasn't doing this forward defense thing. It was actually more in a kind of harmonious axis with national liberation movements. And then I guess I would just maybe end with one maybe counter distinction, right? Is that, like people are fine with Palestinians with rocks in their hands. Nobody calls them imperialists, right? When the rock turns into a rocket and it's a homemade rocket, nobody's going to call them imperialists. But what happens when that same force actually succeeds and achieves liberation and comes to hold in its hand a power that can be imposed on the West? See,
Mm.
in our intellectual frameworks, we have no way of apprehending that sort of force. We can only apprehend the other, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Congo, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in Bolivia, whether it's in Venezuela. We can only comfortably apprehend them when they're weak, when they're in need of a type of solidarity of what are we going to do for them,
Hmm.
right? We can only apprehend them when they're in need of development. But what do we do when all of a sudden they don't need us in the same way? Then what? Right? Then we confuse the issue and we can only see the same as us. We see an imperialist there when it's not, right? So this is a huge task that I think this is a moment for people to step into now. You know, don't fear. I've mentioned this before. Chuck D, way back in the day, there's this album Public Enemy has called Fear of a Black Planet,
Yeah.
right? They don't fear black people existing in a relation of subordination. They don't care. Black people can exist if they're weak, if they're subordinate. What he's saying, I think, is a fear of black sovereignty, of black power.
Hmm.
That's the fear of a black planet. It's like Hassan Nasrallah says, they don't care if you're Muslim. What they care is you're a sovereign Muslim or a non-sovereign Muslim.
Hmm.
Our frameworks, even on the left, even as anti-imperialists, has not stepped up to this task. We shirk away from engaging projects that have actually assumed and built power and exercised that power because we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, it's a great point. There's a essay on that. I can't remember the name of the author, but he talks about the American left having this, or the Western left having this kind of a
Is it Manolo Jones or something? He's a Brazilian author. Is that right? Is he from Brazil?
yeah,
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 yeah.
and
Older essay from a few years ago, right?
yeah, and he talked
Uh,
about the kind of fetishization of martyrdom, and not
exactly. Yeah.
and not in the way that that is actually understood in Islam or anything, but just in the West where we even for folks who
Yeah.
even when they're alive, like we love the Cuban Revolution, like almost unilaterally, we don't love the actual governing of it unilaterally, because governing is much more complicated, right? We love Malcolm or Martin, because they never got to see their dreams or they never got to realize their goals. So to your point, even about Palestine, we love the idea of a free Palestine, but we don't really love the idea of what that would require.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
like it's just
Yeah.
like and I think there's some stuff I had written earlier this year, even this preoccupation with nonviolence, and then even nonviolence not really being nonviolence because nonviolence still requires violence somewhere, but there's just this preoccupation with the the idea of something like you said, when that rock becomes a weapon that can actually do some real damage, and it's not just kind of symbolic of somebody being inferior or under the boot. Yeah, we're all in, but when
Mhm.
that, but when people are able to actually really do it, like yeah, there's a queasiness to it, like, and I don't know fully why it's like that. I have my theories, but that shows up everywhere you go. And I think some of it, like you said, I don't think people are actually as honest about the point you made at the top of your answer was there's just incentives to this stuff. I mean, even me naming the myth Iran is an imperialist regime, like just explicitly stating that there's ways I could have wrote that and that's kind of hems around the issue. But I know by writing that there's people that will just be like, I'm gonna check your podcast, or they see that they're just done. Like they're not, they might like the stuff we do on domestic things, but they see that and they're just like, no, I can't accept that because they behead people or they don't treat their
Mhm.
women correctly. Like, and you're not
Yeah,
even allowed to have a real engagement on these things. It becomes a way to shut the conversation down. So it's not even though a lot of like you said in the last episode, a lot of these things, a lot of those claims are exaggerated anyway. But even when they're true, we're not allowed to have a real engagement of it. It just means okay, that's thrown out immediately.
yeah.
Like there's nothing to be said or to be done with these
Mhm.
people because they did this terrible thing that we can verify possibly. So it's just thrown out. And I just think that it really crushes the imagination. Like you're not able to really even think through. Okay, because you said something else you said in the last episode is like every country has friction and problems,
Yeah,
like and governments do bad things and like that does happen even if you eliminated all the imperialism under like you would still have problems,
exactly.
you know.
Yeah.
But it's like we're not able to really engage that at all. It just becomes a means of shutting it down. And again, I
Mhm.
think that's because it's subconsciously for some of us we know what that means. Once you cross that line and you start saying people have a right to resistance, there's a certain career path that's cut off for you versus if you say, I want the children to to be fed, you know.
Yeah,
And then we
exactly.
all want that to happen, but it's like,
Of course we do.
yeah,
Yeah.
but you can brand yourself off of that. There's a quick tangent, but I don't even think it's the intentions of this person are bad, but I don't know this person who knows, but like Miss Rachel who does like those kid
Mhm.
videos,
Right.
and she's really centered like I care about Palestinian children being bombed, and I'm not knocking her, and I don't particularly care about whether Miss Rachel takes a line on imperialism or anything. I'll be
It
interested.
matters though. It matters.
Yeah, but it's like she can occupy a space of I care about the children and get some pushback from, just full out reactionaries, but supporting children is a relatively conservative position, so you can you can kind of get a universal love to an extent, but if she came out and said, not only do I support the children, but I support the parents of those children doing whatever it takes to liberate their
Yeah.
children.
Yeah.
Then you get into, now people are like, okay, so
Yeah.
to your point, there's a certain containment there, and they will
Yeah.
allow a certain discourse. And even that has to be struggled to even get that small amount of discourse. We couldn't even say we cared about Palestinian children a few years ago.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, no, for sure.
so,
For sure.
so there's a struggle to even get that, but that's it right now. If you go outside of kind of the innocence model, it's
Yeah.
nobody wants to hear that.
No, 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 nobody wants to hear that. And I think like, I had written and spoken about, and this actually seems to have, it often makes people uncomfortable because I haven't talked about Miss Rachel so much, but the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese,
Hmm.
who suffered a lot, who was sanctioned by the United States. But like this, to the similar effect that you're saying is like she to me, this is unforgivable. To me, this is unforgivable. And I know for other people it's different, but to me, she effectively aligns herself with US imperialism strategically at the highest level. She may disagree tactically, okay? So when you're saying people are going to come on your program and they're like, I agree with this, I don't agree with this, I'm probably going to get you some haters with this with this discussion of Albanese. But like, look, I've mentioned this before, but gets to your point. Albanese, 2 or 3 days after 168 people are killed on an attack, a deliberate US attack. Okay. Like we should all think about this as people living in these countries. Like, where are we right now that we just are spectators to a deliberate attack on a children's school? That's how
Hmm.
this war opened.
Yeah.
Where are we having this conversation right now? How are we living in this world? And so she 2 days after tweets out an AI generated image of the children. right? Because the overwhelming majority of those killed were children. There were teachers killed and staff killed too, and their lives are equally mournable as the children's, right? Uh, but the vast majority are children who were killed. And she tweets out an image, but her first sentences are Iran is an illiberal and brutal regime. So what has she effectively done? She's done what I started off the answer with. She's delegitimized the Islamic Republic. That's what the United States wants. They'd say the rule in Western imperialism is you lose your legitimacy when you challenge the basis of imperialism, when you materially put in the conditions for real sovereignty, land reform, military power, etc. Right? Look at the countries that have done this. North Korea, Zimbabwe tries, People's Republic of China, etc. They're the ones who are the villains of the world system. You can find this as a core rule, Cuba, etc. Right? So, like the fact that she does this, and she does it after she's being sanctioned. Can you imagine? They sanction you and you still look to them for authority. You
Hmm.
still want imperialism to forgive you. Because why else are you? She said to Zionists, they accosted her outside of a talk in Geneva, and she said, "Hey, look it, I'm consistent. Nobody's even making me criticize Iran, and I just keep doing it." She said, "I just keep going at them," and it's like only thing that makes sense is because she's looking for legitimation from Western institutions. She has no concern, and maybe it's the same with Miss Rachel, but she has no concern with being accountable to or seeking legitimacy from the very forces that are fighting genocide and imperialism in the region. In fact, you're throwing them under the bus, right? And not only this, I was going to get to this later on in our discussion, but and maybe I'll elaborate on it. And just to drop this point here, okay, I've made this point several times over the last few months. Not only are you seeking legitimacy from Western institutions, right? This is shaping your knowledge. You are not objective when you say these things. When you say, okay, there are repressions, there are XYZ, but how do you know what they are and how they are and the character of them? How
Hmm.
did you come to know this? Do you have, oh, the Iranian people told me, which Iranian people? Through which channels? Through which
Hmm.
authorities? In which context? In which structural analysis? This is not to minimize that people may have suffered or experienced one or the other issue. But the significance and the valence it ends up assuming is never an innocent discussion, right? So if what is shaping your production of knowledge? Now, no, none of them take seriously the Islamic Republic as a legitimate source of knowledge. This is a huge problem. Just like nobody takes seriously Hamas as a legitimate source. You got to say Hamas run health ministry. You got to say Hezbollah run this. We can't even, we mourn Palestinians, but we cannot even take their leaders in Gaza as legitimate sources of knowledge. So we're so constrained in how we can even know the world. Like, so if the Islamic Republic issues a statement on what happened in Minab and you follow that through, the country I live in right now can throw you in jail, right? With the legislation they've passed. So
Hmm.
like, or you don't get a job, or you're going to be ostracized. Now, I think as we've seen in the last few days, things may be rapidly changing. We might be, well, there might be, and we can discuss as to why, right? Things have shifted, but this is the way things have operated, right? Is
Yeah. Like we said, we couldn't
Yeah.
even say we love their children, love Palestinian children a few years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so but that's such a low bar,
That's what
right?
I'm
Like so
saying. Yeah.
now when we
Yeah.
now we can say we love their children, but still in a dehumanizing way.
Oh, yeah.
You can still love their children, but you demand of them an innocence, right? You demand of them a weakness. That's constantly what you want. When they hold power, you disbelieve them, right? They become shifty Orientals. They become untrustworthy, right? So I think like that is a major issue also in terms of imperial production of knowledge, right? Is
Hmm.
ask yourselves why you've been trained to not take seriously or even learn about the traditions, intellectual, theological material that underpin the resistance that you might otherwise say, I'm with in wanting to stop the genocide.
Yeah. And I think this is a problem that even exists with folks even within the United States or about histories in the United States. Because even when people discuss the Black Panther Party, similarly, it used to just be anathema to talk about it at all. and now it's become popular to talk about them, but more so within the framework, kind of like you were talking about the Hamas Health Ministry. So we'll talk about the food program, or we'll talk about, the sickle cell programs. These things are all important because they, provide for the communities. But it's it's almost as if the fact that they picked up guns and defended their communities becomes like
Yeah.
it gets pecked on. It's on a lower pecking order. We care more about the survival programs and all the work that if you don't attach the other things to it, really just comes off as charity work. Like if you don't know
Yeah.
the full programs of the Panthers, it's just charity. Not to say that's what it was, but that's how it becomes understood. Because there's still even within black politics, I noticed that tendency to point to everything but yeah, they also did, like there are stories, particularly at the beginning, of Huey putting a gun to a pig's head, right? Like that did happen, but that part that part's never as important. Or we get a movie about Fred Hampton, but it's about the snitch. Like there's some saying, even I'm trying to make this connection for people who may not be as tapped into what's happening outside of the borders. Like
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
here, we see that where there's a way to acknowledge these figures, but only in a particular way that doesn't see them, doesn't really take them seriously, doesn't see them on an eye to eye level, and it's like, oh, they provided for their communities, they gave their kids breakfast programs, you know,
Yeah.
like or
Yeah.
something like that,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
they fought the pigs, that's. That part I just see slowly slipping away, even as we tell people to read their biographies, or even as we shout Assad a chance at protests or whatever. There's this tendency, like
Yeah.
Common was at Asada's. They had a Common the
Oh
rapper. They
boy.
had an
Yeah.
event
Yeah.
in New York for Asada, and he had made a song that honestly a lot of us learned about Asada through of a certain age. So he was there
Yeah.
performing that. And then
Right.
within the next few days, he goes to perform for Obama, who put her on the FBI's top
That's
10 most
right. Yeah.
wanted,
Yeah.
and no contradiction is seen. But again, these people are just ornaments. They're not seriously. We don't take them seriously as people for real liberation struggle. They're ornaments that they're almost stepping stones for people's careers. And but the most militant things that they did are the things that that's cool, but they fed children, you know.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I mean, I don't want to get too off topic, but just when you said ornament or something, it really like piqued a thought in my head around like, I mean, I went really abstract for a minute there when you were talking, but it just made me think about like, the notion of like an image, like the way of an image or a form or an appearance and how it can be detached from its essence, right? Like
Mm,
in the service of power. You know what I
hmm
mean? Like, so it's like what they want in the examples you're saying is they always want you to be singing "We shall overcome," right? They're like, this is
mm,
the place, and because it means something for U.S. culture, it matters for U.S. culture. They need that story of an overcoming because it legitimizes actually the U.S. state, right? To take the image of Asada, to take the struggle of an Asada or a Malcolm, and to put it in the service of Obama is to put it into the service of this trajectory that you shall overcome within the parameters of the US state. You never will. You actually have to constantly be overcome. You can never come to a position where you have overcome and you are sovereign, right? Like, and actually, you can find these connections that you're making here in the very writings of Malcolm X,
hmm
in his speeches, or even listening to Tupac. And I'm just saying this because if you're trying to get people to understand
hmm
the space between them, like, look, uh, Malcolm X has a brilliant speech. I'm sure people have heard it on China and India, where he basically says, why is China hated? And why is India loved? He said, India is loved but not feared. China is feared but not loved. He's like, I'd rather be China. They respect China. He
hmm
said, because China got rid of all their Uncle Toms. That was his language, word for word,
Yeah.
right?
I go for Mao Zedong much more than Nehru, because I think that Nehru brought his country up in a beggar's role. The role of India in its reliance upon the West during the years since it got its supposed independence has it today just as helpless and dependent as it was when it first got its independence. Whereas in China, the Chinese fought for their independence. They became militant right from the outstart. And today, even though they aren't loved, they are respected. Though the West doesn't love them, the West respects them. Now the West doesn't respect India, but it loves India.
When I was in prison, I read an article in Life magazine showing a little Chinese girl, 9 years old. Her father was on his hands and knees, and she was pulling the trigger because he was an Uncle Tom Chinaman. Yeah. When they had the revolution over there, they took a whole generation of Uncle Toms, just wiped them out. And within 10 years, that little girl became a full-grown woman. No more Toms in China. And today it's one of the toughest, roughest, most feared countries on this earth by the white man, because there are no Uncle Toms over there.
He's like, India didn't, so they loved them, you know? But he's basically looking at that to say, like, look at this black struggle in the United States. It's not a struggle for we shall overcome to become Obama. It's a sovereignty question. When they're saying, they're not saying we're segregationists because we're better than everybody. They're saying we need sovereignty. We need power, right? That's what we need, like what China got. And it's like when I mentioned Tupac, I'll mention it very briefly. I won't get into him, but you know, if you listen to I think one of his second rap group, the Outlaws. I think he had Thug Life and then the Outlaws. You know, he named the rappers. Like one of them was Khomeini. Like, you know, the name was. And why did he give the name Khomeini or Hussein? Like how inaccurate he was in putting all these like diverse figures together. He was trying to make a point, right? He was trying to make a point. These are enemies of the United States. They're enemies of the United States because of the scale at which they challenge the United States, right? And it's I think significant that Khomeini was one of the outlaws for him, right? So
yeah, Tupac was a interesting figure in terms of, I mean, at the end of his life, he was reading a lot of war theory stuff in general. So he was reading Stalin.
Yeah.
You know, he was reading old stuff like Machiavelli and things like that. That's why
I mean, that's not a story I need to get into now, but you know, the whole reason, maybe I'll drop it really quickly, we could bracket this as an entertaining sidebar for your listeners, is the whole reason I did political science as a major was because of Tupac, because you know, he changed his name to Machiavelli, and everybody thought he faked his death. And like we were so dumb. We were like, oh, you know, this guy Machiavelli is Machiavelli, and he advised the prince to fake his death. And so, you know, we would go into like the libraries and steal Machiavelli books from the university library where I lived, and we try to like find it, we couldn't. And then I'd go to university, and I'm studying a business degree, and I'm looking through the course catalog, and I see in the political science thing a class on Machiavelli. And I was like, I got to take this class. But to take this class, I had to do like first year, second year classes. And that's how I left my program and went into political science to try to cut to the truth of how Tupac faked his death. I was living in Cuba with Asada. How Machiavelli can teach us that.
That's hilarious. And then you went down a long rabbit hole from there. Yeah.
Yeah. Here I am today.
Shout out to Pac, 20 years later, still having relevance. 30 years now, sorry. Yeah, 30 years later. Okay, I guess to move on to the elephant in the room here, we may not get to all these questions, but I think so there was this letter, and I'm glad we got to lay down a lot of that foundation because it shows how silly all of this becomes. But there was this letter that was published in the Guardian, which is what got us on this call together, called Two Iran's Political Prisoners Trapped Between Two Blades of Scissors. This was an open letter that several academics have now recanted and walked away from. I'm gonna read the list, whatever's left. I also don't know if the Guardian has not taken down some of the names on here that are just that they don't even want to be a part of it. So I'm just gonna read them all.
Yeah, you should read them all because none of them has done a sufficient accounting yet. So
Yeah, Alberto Toscano, Angela Davis, Bernardine Doran, Bill Ayers, Sherry Moraga, Dan Berger. Damn, I didn't know Dan was on here too. Hussam El Halawali, Jarius Bonaji, Jason Stanley, that shakes. Judith Butler, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Michael Lowy, Michael Mansfield, Mumia Abu-Jamal. I'll get to who's not on this list after I'm done reading it. I already said this in the intro, but Nadia Abu El Hajj, Rashid Khalidi, Ricardo. I'm probably butchering some of these names. Jimenez, Robyn D.G. Kelley, Ruha Benjamin, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Sanan Atun, Walden F. Bello, Yasin Al Hajj Salah. Their bios are listed in the article. I'll leave that in the notes. I'm not going to read the bios. Robyn Kelley came out with a video saying he wasn't fully aware of what he was signing, and the process was kind of shady. He was also on his. He let us know he was on his
He needs a better PR
anniversary.
team. He
Yeah,
needs some like basic PR 101.
he he was with his wife on their anniversary, and he looked like he was on some kind of yacht or something. I don't know.
Today is my wedding anniversary, but I'm posting this because I feel an urgent need to let people know that I have taken my name off of the letter purporting to be a statement of anti-imperialist solidarity with political prisoners. That was my mistake. The circumstances in which we were asked to sign that letter were a bit shaky. What appeared, in print wasn't exactly what I had initially seen, but I take full responsibility for that. That's the meaning of mea culpa, mea culpa. So with that, I hope people can forgive me and all those who signed it. Know my politics are crystal clear, and I want to just be able to enjoy the next 2 days
He was on
with my
some kind
wife
of
before I
boat
go back to
above the
work.
water. So he let us know that. Mamiya, it's so Mamiya's on was on the list, but it appears there's some challenges, or he may have not been aware. More information needs to come out, but there was a plate I think that Jared from Millennials and Killing Capitalism. There was a plate that Mamiya wrote
That's
on,
right.
and
Yeah.
it described the Iran resistance, to these imperialist aggressions of war. It described that in a pretty positive light. So it would be odd that he would sign a letter like this with the way he's spoken about Iran. There was
Yeah.
someone else. I had it. The name is slipping me on this list. There was somebody else that came out, and they were like, "This was a total fuck up. I shouldn't have been on here. I apologize." And I don't. And then they locked their account. And they didn't want to talk about it anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
that's too convenient though.
uh, so so there's been several people who have walked away from it, but this is a relatively long list, and a lot of these names are well known in their fields, and known for good reasons. I'm sure there was people disappointed. I will say, without like calling out any one individual, some of these folks, if you look a little more closely at how they move, this isn't necessarily a contradiction or an aberration. Even if you might agree with them on other fronts, this is relatively consistent with how they moved. But so people have more context, the letter is equating Iran and Israel and the United States with basically being equally evil powers, and that political prisoners are stuck in between, as they say in the title, between two blades of scissors, which is a quote actually taken from a New York Times article of someone who was in prison in Iran for, I think, espionage or something like that. Um, but in the piece they say, on one side you face there's talking to the political prisoners, or what they label as political prisoners in Iran. says on one side, you face the Islamic Republic that from its inception enforced absolute social and political control based on an exclusionary ideology. It is a system that claims a counter-imperial power while it's using its very logic of domination, systems of carcelality, torture, and execution. On the other side, you face the aggression and violence of the very imperialist and Zionist forces the Islamic Republic purports to stand against. So this article drew, at least within the online spaces we're in, this drew like more condemnation, honestly, than I expected. But it drew a lot of criticism, and that's why people have began to recant, their position. And it's I cause, I think, in some cases deeper reflection beyond just the kind of dunking on people for not being, I don't left enough or whatever. So want to get your response. You've written a thread on this, and why this, even if can seem trivial and kind of just left in fighting, why does it still deserve a real response?
Yeah, it does. It does deserve a real response, and it deserves real reflection from all of us, not just the signatories. So it's a bigger. It's going to open up a bigger set of issues, and we should use this as an opportunity to ask hard questions of ourselves, to rethink our received frameworks, and to open ourselves up, like I said again, to the forces of the resistance that are fighting genocide and imperialism on the ground. So, like, first, I'll just work through, even though I know it's been roundly condemned, I think there's still some points that need to be emphasized regarding the passage you read in the letter as a whole. Okay. So like just off the top, like it's really shoddy, right? Like the letter itself, it's not cited or sourced in any way. So you can throw around words like the ones that I just wrote them down as you were speaking. Like you can throw around things like absolute social and political control based on an exclusionary ideology. What does that mean? Like, what are you talking about there? You're just throwing out these things without any, and then you talk about torture, execution, carcerality, as though it is just assumed that you say this about the Islamic Republic and it is assumed that that's what's happening. It's like when people used to talk about China, they would think that all you have to say is, oh, Chinese people can't think freely. Xi Jinping is telling them what to think. He says, go this way, they go this way. So if a Chinese person would say anything, and people would be like, oh, sure. Who told you to say that? That would always be the response. Like this kind of inherent skepticism of their very humanity, misanthropic skepticism. And so you have like here, just throwing out these words with no citation, with no sourcing or anything, right? This is assumption. But what's more significant is what they're doing here in this letter. And this is why it's unforgivable. So people who are recanting, withdrawing, they need to explain how they aligned with imperialism. Because this letter is not two sides. You're aligning with US imperialism for the reasons that I said. That opening sentence, that from its inception, the Islamic Republic has enforced absolute control based on an exclusionary ideology. You're trying to delegitimize the whole project of the Islamic Republic, which is what US imperialism is trying to do. You are aligned with it. It was what Albanese was doing. This is a rendering delegitimate. And what they are doing is they're doing it at a very moment at which Iran is the sole state in the world system that is fighting the forces of genocide that we've all been pained to see. So you're delegitimizing this state with really vague language, and it's very imprecise. And I know why it is imprecise, right? Because they know that the landscape in Iran is much more complex. They don't want to actually have a concrete discussion of Iran. So you just throw out these words. Now, okay, before actually getting into more deeply, I wanted to unpack one sentence in particular. So it says, and I think this is where people get really confused, especially like anarchists and abolitionists, it'll say something like, it is a system that claims to counter imperial power while using its very logic of domination and systems of carcerality, torture, and execution. Imperialism cannot be reduced to domination, okay? Like, and I mentioned to you this before we were talking, I really encourage people to read Engels' essay called On Authority. And the history of revolutions has shown us authority in and of itself is not imperialist. Authority in and of itself is not a problem, because if you have a revolution, what, are you not going to bring proletarian authority to bear on the bourgeoisie? Like, are you not going to dominate those hostile class forces? So in and of itself, those words don't tell us much, right? And I think I don't need to demonstrate why Iran's not imperialist. I think we've already done that. In fact, Iran is anti-imperialist, and they are confusing this issue, right? They are for me, the big takeaway is Robyn Kelley, Angela Davis, all of them. What they have to sit with right now, okay, is look at the moment we're in right now. We are in a moment where the Palestinians in Gaza are being squeezed, right? They're trying to force surrender permanently on them, and the conditions are getting so dire. We're in the aftermath of this strike on this children's school in Mina. In the context of all of this, they attack Iran. Okay, they attack Iran in order to isolate the Palestinians. They want to delegitimize this state, right? To force it to stop backing resistance groups through the region. This is what the signatories are participating in. And I think it's knowingly, and I'll tell you why knowingly. Angela Davis and Robyn Kelley signed a letter in March at the height of the war saying no to war, no to the Islamic Republic. And one of the things in the letter was opposition to the Islamic Republic's anti-Western rhetoric. You know, that like they signed on to this letter in March. So now Robyn Kelley is claiming innocence, right? That, oh, I didn't know. Why did you sign this letter in March? If you are innocent, then come out and tell us what your position on the Islamic Republic is today. Like, do you understand the relationship between the Islamic Republic and the liberation of Palestine, the resistance to genocide today, right? That you are actually reproducing the founding conditions of imperialism by delegitimizing the Islamic Republic. Now, what I will say, though, is those are the immediate points that need to be made, okay? There's no easy forgiveness, except Mumia. Mumia should be accepted in all of this, I will say. I saw what he wrote, and I think for Mumia, everybody should exercise patience and solidarity. Without question.
This is also someone struggling with their vision, struggling to literally see.
And I think there's a difference, I'll say, between Mumia and every other signatory. Mumia's work doesn't logically lead us to this letter, right? Mumia's work is actually anti-imperialist. Mumia's work, but Angela Davis is not. Robyn Kelley's is not. This is the bigger point I want to make. This is the point I made in the thread. It's too easy for us to put everything on the signatories. Now I'll get into why they failed, right? I think other people have already talked about this, like why this failed, this narrative collapsed. And I think we're all a little stunned, right? That how broadly it's collapsed. But like there is a problem I saw somebody say, I feel really betrayed because I learned about colonialism and imperialism from Angela Davis and whoever else. That's a problem. It's a problem that you learned about it from Angela Davis and not Sam Moyo, the great scholar from Zimbabwe. Nobody was allowed to read Sam Moyo. Sam Moyo was driven from the halls of Western academia because he supported Zimbabwe's land reclamation program in the early 2000s. And people said he was a supporter of the authoritarian Robert Mugabe. Okay? So he's driven out of the Western academy. He's in Zimbabwe, but I'm saying he doesn't become acceptable in polite company.
Right.
Until white scholars start jacking his scholarship. They start jacking his scholarship years later, like, oh, wait a minute. Distributing land to small Black family farmers is good for development. Moyo was saying that before. But we don't read Sam Moyo. And even Samir Amin, a lot of people read him, but I will tell you, he was not read when I was in graduate school in the way an Angela Davis was read, in the way a Walter Mignolo is read, in the way a lot of these decolonial scholars who don't touch that question I talked about at the beginning, okay? If your frameworks through which you learn about race and colonialism and imperialism, okay, that it does not address the sovereignty question on the world systemic scale, it will bring you to this letter time and again, okay? Because you're talking about anti-racism. You're talking about anti-racism. You might even be talking about the horrors of the US war in Iraq, but you can't grapple with the positive program of sovereignty of the states that the United States is attacking, right? So the clearest example to me is none of them will engage North Korea. North Korea is beyond our political discourse. This is a state, you exist, you get paid, Robyn Kelley gets paid a huge salary, right? They all get paid massive salaries here. And this is a state that committed genocide effectively against North Korea. 20% of their population killed. And North Korea resists and becomes an anchor for anti-imperialism militarily throughout the world. Why do we read about the Zapatistas and not North Korea? right? Why do we learn only about anti-racist projects that aren't sovereign, right? Why can't we go to where Malcolm was wanting us to go? You know what I mean? So their frameworks are containing us. That's why Syria happened. When the Syrian proxy war happens, there's no opposition here because they handcuff everybody by saying it's authoritarian, it's repressive, etc. The sin of the Syrian state, the Syrian Arab Republic, is that it would not listen to Western imperialism and abandoning the axis of resistance. You know, they kept giving the Syrian Arab Republic options. If you remove your support for Hezbollah and the Palestinians, we'll lift sanctions, we'll integrate you. And they kept saying no. And then you have these Western academics like Gilbert Achar and a lot of the people who signed this letter. They'll constantly say no to imperialism, no to Libya, no to imperialism, no to Syria. It's happened time and again. We have to take stock at this moment. It's not enough to say, oh, look at them, I'm better than Robyn Kelley. No, we're not. If we are within those frameworks, it's time for us to hold ourselves to account. Okay. For some of the discussion that I said before, right? Like how our very terms of knowledge have been shaped by the system of imperialism, right? What is acceptable and what is not. How we get legitimacy in these systems. I can say Black Lives Matter. I can say power to the workers. If I say no to the Islamic Republic, no to North Korea, if I say no to sovereign projects, anything is possible. We have to rethink those frameworks. We have to ask, why were we not able to engage those projects, right? So that's what I would say. The big takeaway from me from the letter is, if you're feeling betrayed and hurt, ask, why was I reading them and not other thinkers of anti-imperialism? You know, people love to mention Sankara. Sankara was close to Samir Amin, right? What is the sovereign project of Sankara and Amin? Why aren't you learning that in grad school, right? What is Sankara's understanding of Stalin? What is Rodney's understanding of Stalin? Why does Stalin say we have to do in 10 years what the West did in 100 years? That's a sovereignty question. It's not an easy world, but it's the world in which we live, right? So it's like, this question, we have to revisit our frameworks. I call this framework that they operate in, I call it the Las Casas paradigm. Okay, I think Western scholarship has been trapped within this. And I call it this because Las Casas was a 16th century Dominican, I guess, priest or thinker who basically mourns Spanish colonialism. He's upset at what they're doing to indigenous people. And he documents their culture. He documents the violence. He says, look at how rich their culture and history is. But he never questions Spanish sovereignty over their territory. He wants the Spanish to give them rights.
Right.
And that's the paradigm within which we've remained trapped. Now, they may not say this. Angela Davis is not going to say this. But effectively, that's what it becomes, right? If you don't actually engage with real sovereign projects. So that's the first takeaway, I would say. Now, this transitions me to the second point I made in the thread. This narrative has collapsed. People are now, they'll say, we're living through a world that's in transformation, and now everything is open. Everything is to be put to question. The old world is dying, the new one is waiting to be born. How will we fill that in, right? Now, why is it dying though? Why is this narrative collapsing? It's not collapsing because we came up with good ideas, right? It's not collapsing because consciousness breeds consciousness.
Right.
It's like going back to Marx. Life breeds consciousness. Material transformation forces upon us new thought, right? And it's the Palestinian resistance that forced a narrative shift on Palestine. Just like it's Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran, their ability to defeat the United States in this war has exposed so much. Okay, it's exposed the truth. The fact that there hasn't been surrender, and what truth? What's the fundamental truth that stands before us today that we cannot look past? We saw a genocide happen because Al-Aqsa flood, like Yahya Sinwar argues, Al-Aqsa flood exposed the world. It exposed the truth of the Zionist occupation, its genocidal nature. We stood up. We fought. We were oppressed. We couldn't sustain. Now we can see clearly who is fighting. We can see very clearly that it's the Islamic Republic. It's being attacked by the genocidal state of Israel because of its position on Palestine. No other reason. We know that if Iran did not stand with Palestine, there would be no war right now. If it was like Saudi Arabia, it would not be attacked, right? It's solely because of this position. So we should not congratulate ourselves about some enlightened consciousness. We should think that we are being dragged into history. History is dragging us by the forces moving history, which is the axis of resistance in this case. Elsewhere in the world, it's other forces, but here's the axis of resistance. Now, what does that call on us right now then? Then it returns us to this question I was basically posing. Don't feel sad about Robyn Kelley. Stop reading Robyn Kelley and read Sam Moyle, right? Or go open yourself up once and read the intellectual, theological sources that underpin the resistance in West Asia to imperialism today. If you're asking why, when the encampments were repressed in 2024 spring, and everybody felt like those arrests were going to generate more protest, they were going to generate more resistance, but it didn't. I'm not trying to say that there isn't or things are defeated. That's not the point. But the point is, the repression did have an impact. It did cool things down. It did scatter things, right? It did break up that. Now you can say we need stronger organization, but we also have to ask, we do not have the capability or the capacity or the will to carry cost in the way the axis of resistance carries costs. So can we read? Can we learn? Can we move ourselves away from being spectators of genocide, spectators of the resistance, to opening ourselves up to those worlds that are criminalized? Now, I know people are going to say, well, I can be thrown in jail. But if we all do it collectively, that's a different thing. Don't do it as an individual hero. Don't make yourself out to be whatever. Make it a collective practice to get together and read the works of Yahya Sinwar. Learn about Sayyid Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Learn about Khomeini. Learn about Ali Shariati, right? Learn about the Shia Islamic liberation theology that stands beneath the axis of resistance, that stands beneath the Islamic Republic, right? That grounds a very different conception of the human being than the one we're used to. And I'll just make this point very briefly. Okay, careerism, our fear of losing everything, is what brings us away from the struggle. And it's understandable to many people, right? But we live in capitalist societies that put the immediacy of profit and pleasure in front of us as the ends we should be most concerned with. So if I go to a protest and a rally and now I could lose all of that, am I willing to pay that cost? Well, if I pay it, is the next person willing to pay it? Probably not, because I know how people are created. I know the human being that exists in these societies is a short-term, scared human being. It's a cowardly human being because it's a human being that is in constant market competition and feels like it could lose everything at once. It's not one that's centered on principle, right? But we see this other world. If you read or you listen, I encourage the youth who check out your program, just go on Instagram and listen to Khamenei's speeches. Listen to what he's talking about. He's talking about Palestine, but he's talking about the human being and the human soul. What he's saying is what's at stake is our souls right now. The Epstein class, these imperialists, they want to reduce us to nothing more than immediately profit and pleasure-seeking beings. And what he's saying is that's not what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to sacrifice for one another. We're supposed to create the worlds of one another. We are supposed to be just and humble and truthful, right? For those principles, you should be willing to stand and sacrifice. And that's what we're seeing in West Asia, right? That's what we're seeing in Iran. In Yemen, what did we see in Yemen? We saw people saying, I felt such, not guilt, but I felt so uneasy seeing the children of Gaza being bombed. And now that we are being bombed, I feel at least maybe we're taking some bombs away from Gaza. In Minab, if you listen to what's coming out of Minab, there's a documentary, Still Minab, right? Like, so if you listen to the accounts in this documentary, the parents of the children who were lost would be like, see, we are even closer to Gaza now, right? We are even more in solidarity with the Palestinians. They wanted us to stop this. This is only going to draw us closer to Palestine, right? So I think this moment, this letter, this crisis asks of us something big, something large. It asks of us why we have failed time and again, why we cannot revolutionize our societies, why we cannot revolutionize ourselves even, right? To revolutionize ourselves is to say what Che Guevara says when he says to make revolution is a revolution comes out of love, but that requires sacrifice. that requires, like, and I say this often, Che says it's not enough during the Vietnam War. It's not enough to say to the Vietnamese, I wish you well, I stand with you, I support you. He says that's meaningless. Will you join them on their march to victory or death? Okay. Those are big words, and maybe people brush them off when they hear them, but that's a spirit we have to somehow try to capture because otherwise we spectate. And if we say the signatories are now complicit, where does it leave many of us then otherwise? We are also spectators. So I think the time is at hand for us to at least refuse the criminalization of the knowledge of the resistance. You know, when and I'll tell you one reason why this circles back to the letter. Okay, look, if the Islamic Republic is saying there were Mossad agents on the streets in January, right? That this is an imperialist plot, this coup d'état. They are trying to divide our communities. They're shooting, and they've done this before. You know, the coup in 1953.
Israel basically admitted to this as well.
Yeah, and when I was on your show last time, I mentioned in 1953 they did this. The CIA paid armed agitators to attack different locations in Iran to delegitimize the Mossadegh government. So we know they have it. But when the Islamic Republic says this, we don't believe them. Why don't we take them serious as a legitimate source of knowledge? When they're saying, look, you're handcuffing us. This letter is handcuffed. What you're telling us is we can't take any action to stop those who are bringing violence to our streets in order to support the Zionist genocidal project. When Mossad admits to it, then everybody's like, oh, look, why does it take Mossad admitting to it for you to believe and you disbelieve what the Islamic Republic is saying? Why is that the case? Ask yourself this question. This is what this moment calls on you. Remove the fear. And I know there's a criminalization. They'll say, if you read this, if you speak of this, we'll throw you in prison. I understand that. But understand that that structure is what allows for this letter to be produced. That is what then brings us time and again to this problem of disbelief of the resistance. And then all we can do is approach them as either we save them or we wish them well, but we can't be in real solidarity. Okay. So the letter, because it doesn't do that, cannot give any space to the reality on the ground today. Okay. The reality on the ground today is they weren't able to defeat Iran. So now they want to again try to do internal subterfuge. They want to divide Iranian society and balkanize it. And when you say, oh, we're with you in a generic term against carcerality, that means you're going to criticize when any move by Iran to try to bring under control. They say control is bad in that letter to bring these Zionist elements under control. So yeah, I think this moment asks something big of us. How are we going to respond? And will this return us to our responsibility in America, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in elsewhere, to fighting this genocide? What does it ask of us today? Right? Like, how are we going to raise the costs to a point? Because what I'll say, and I know maybe we're going to talk about this, we're running out of time, but like, look, they can't defeat Iran on the battlefield. They cannot, right? But the issue today is there is no social force in our countries that can stop the war machine. It doesn't exist.
Right.
So even as we see that it's destroying our own economies, even as we see that it's irrational, we're sitting here without any ability to stop it. There's no social formation at all that has the means to do it. It's dumbfounding, actually, right? Like how actually like that, and that's the issue. Like why is the Board of Peace doing all this chicanery in Palestine? Why are Palestinians still being slaughtered this week on Sunday, like last week? Why were they being still slaughtered? Why are they being starved still in front of us with all these phony agreements that they violate again and again? It's because they're in our societies. They've been defeated there. Iran has given an opening to the resistance here, but it's not matched here. That's the issue. Imperialism is the primary contradiction. Yeah. Anti-imperialism will open space for labor struggle, racial justice struggles, all of these struggles. But it has to be matched at some point with some correspondent organization, and that's been lacking, right? So I think this maybe hopefully will be an opening to some of these bigger questions.
No, that's I'm probably a bit of a pessimist on people's ability to reflect on that scale, but I do appreciate the offering that you made because yeah, it is easy, particularly if you're on Twitter, very much, particularly on Twitter or just social media spaces and even academia and social justice spaces to just kind of see this as another almost like some of this stuff's part of why I don't like engaging it too much. It starts to just be gossip. Like
Yeah,
it's intellectual gossip. It's like it on its surface it appears like there's that we're doing something, but to your point, even us opposing the letter and going really hard on that gives us a sense that that's anti-imperialism, right? Just opposing the letter, just criticizing the signatories and not the process even leads to your point of even that produces these kind of letters because it's not
yeah,
an aberration to your point. It's not,
exactly.
this doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. There's a knowledge production system in place that produces these logics over and over and over again. And even though that might be in flux right now, and the condemnation does demonstrate that, like that
Mm.
doesn't have the same hegemony it once had. Um, it's also just, I think people are like, why are we doing this in the middle of a war? Just common sense level. But yeah, I think we do need to reflect more on yeah, why don't we read any of the people you mentioned, or even, or why does it take the CIA to recognize that they did something that the country told you they did a year ago? You know, like it just recently came out. There was a leak, I think it was to the Washington Post, the CIA basically admitting that Venezuela did not tamper in their elections in what was that 24. But you had
Mhm.
people, prominent folks even on the left, they holding that
Exactly.
position. You know,
Yeah,
repression, they stole the election, and then it comes out that they didn't even believe that. Or we know, you can read old CIA documents about the Soviet Union, and they're like, they really wasn't trying to come for us like that.
hmm,
Like this is stuff they say early on in the Cold War, and we don't acknowledge that till the war is over, quote unquote, or that particular
yeah,
iteration of the Cold War. And that stuff doesn't have any material effect. I mean, you might be right. Like you get to be right in the long run, or you get to say, I told y'all, but it doesn't change the fact that though, Venezuela, that is one of the many things they use as a justification to chop off the
exactly,
head. Yeah, to
exactly.
take the leader.
Yeah,
That these things or the protesters in Iran that, folks were saying, even going back to when it was that stuff popped up on the women's rights and everybody was you know, talking about they stand with our Iranian women and stuff. And there was a lot of evidence then, that was being contrived and exaggerated. And you saw these celebrities get involved. But when you're in the middle of it, that's what's I think so challenging is when these things are happening in real time, like you said with Syria, you cannot speak on it. And then there's like it's like those news articles where there's like a retraction or something. There's this retraction that comes out kind of quietly later on, like, oh, Syria was just a proxy to kill the resistance off. It wasn't about freeing the Syrian people. Oh, Ukraine isn't about sovereignty for Ukrainians or any of that. Every
yeah,
time, but we always have to accept these things after the damage is done, which doesn't
hmm,
materially really do anything. I mean, again, you get to be right, but what does that mean? You know?
yeah. No,
Um,
and people like to watch like The Matrix, and they're like, "Oh, I don't even know, I don't even know that movie." I'm just bringing it up because everybody wants to be like they want to be like a hard person who takes the right pill. Like the one, what everyone
the
shows you.
red pill, yeah, yeah, red pill.
The red pill shows you the real. Is that
Yeah, the
right?
red pills are real, and it was the blue
Black
pill was
pill.
the if you want to go back into live in the matrix.
Yeah. So, but like, we all keep taking this illusionary pill, like because we know enough. So that it asks a deeper question of how we are constituted. Like we have to ask like this really deep question: how are we constituted as subjects? Because like Vincent Bevins wrote a book some years ago called the Jakarta Method,
Hmm.
and in this book, and I'm wondering even if like what Vincent Bevins thinks about Iran right now, because in that book itself, Bevins argues basically like that uh, he demonstrates that during the coup against Mossadegh, they were ridiculing people who were saying this is the CIA. They were actually ridiculing them, saying, "Oh yeah, sure, it's the CIA. The CIA is everywhere. Is that the CIA?" And it was the CIA.
Yeah.
you know? And we read these books and we're like, oh wow, they did this. I can't, they were backing in Xinjiang, they were doing this stuff in the 19, oh wow, I can't believe this. But then when push comes to shove, we have no spine because we don't want to be called dictator lover. We don't want to be called
Mm.
authoritarian lover. We become spineless, right? We become spineless because even coming to see something is not enough because the structure in which we live is a structure that punishes you if you read certain things and speak a certain way and ask certain questions and rewards you the other way, right? Even if you see it, and then you won't even realize that all of a sudden you're thinking a certain way. One day I'm reading about the CIA 953. I'm like, oh my God. But then I realized to get this job or to get this funding or to work with this professor or whatever, I got to think this way and I got to work this way. And then 5 years later, I didn't even realize now I'm carrying a whole framework where I oppose imperialism, but definitely all states are bad. And I definitely oppose no to the Islamic Republic, no to whatever, right? So if we're not careful, we're not aware of how this system is shaping our consciousness all the time, right? And so a moment like this could be a moment, it can be silly if people just get obsessed with like their egos and be like, ha, I'm better than Robyn Kelley. Ha,
Yeah.
I'm better than this person. Or look at me. I proved them wrong and I made them retract. There's also this like strange competition we see going online is like
Yeah.
who's going to be the baddest person forcing them into a retraction instead of asking these harder questions of ourselves, which we should be, all of us should be doing that right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is again, there's a deeper question, more of an existential question in terms of, I mean, we all are guilty of it, especially here in the West, where you claim you're like, they say fake it till you make it or whatever, right? Like you're gonna fake it and then when you make it, you can flip it. This never happens, like because it's really not possible. Like it doesn't actually make sense. But there's this
Mm.
idea that I'm gonna, unless you went into it and you're part of some like clandestine organization and you went in as a spy or something, unless you're doing it on that scale, this idea that you as a subject or an individual can go to school, read all the bullshit, but you're still secretly a communist, revolutionary deep down. They just don't know it yet. And then when you get tenure, that's when you're gonna like reveal. Like this
Yeah,
never happens. This is one of the most failed strategies I've heard because I've heard a lot of people articulate that in my own lifetime. Never happens, like and my one of my co-author and mentor, he talks about how he always says there's no such thing as selling out, not because people don't do terrible stuff. It's just he was like, as you climb the social mobility ladder, your tastes change, you become in proximity to
exactly.
different things, you get more
Exactly.
comfortable, you want to protect certain things, and you just but this does change you materially, but I think a lot of folks believe there's still the undergrad that first entered in, even though now you are 20 years removed from the neighborhood you grew up in, where
Exactly.
you're not connected to that struggle anymore, but you still remember yourself as that. So that is a question of what is the structure we live in that is producing that kind of psychosis, where
That's really interesting.
yeah,
If I can speak on that, that's really, I think, I mean, we're kind of getting all over the place here with our discussion, but that's okay. So, like, I'm really fascinated by this point because to me, like, I've reflected a lot, and it's kind of tormented me in a certain way as to, and I know people have pushed back, like even today when I wrote about how we failed the Palestinians, and I don't mean that to be defeatist, right? I don't mean that, but it just. I'm haunted, by like the energy of 2024. I'm haunted by what was possible there and then what happened, right? And then I see if I tell you the truth, right? I see a lot of people who have benefited from the fight against the genocide, like who have engaged, who've been granted institutional access, as institutions try to normalize things. They'll give
mhm,
somebody, not the person who's popping off the most, but maybe somebody else who is there, they'll give them a cushy job. Or in an academic association, you'll get a better position, right? So, and you're seeing instead people's platforms growing, right? You're seeing people's platforms growing, and I'm not blaming people. This is not an individual question. I'm just saying we're seeing this happening. And so without even noticing it, our egos, and this might seem like, why are we talking about ego, right? It's just when we come to this question of character and conduct, we don't usually pay attention to it when we think about political organizing. It's too urgent. We got to get people together and we got to fight. But who are we? What is our
Mm.
being? How do we conduct ourselves? This can't just happen through words. I can't just say, I want to be a good person. I want to fight imperialism. I know what happened in 1953. I can't just speak it. I have to live it, which means I have to be iterative. I have to be repetitive in my practices. I have to produce myself as an honest, trustworthy, committed comrade who's not going to bounce. And how do I do that? Well, okay, if the reward structure is something we're saying that keeps bringing us back, then do we need to pay more attention to how we show up for one another so we don't feel that fear in the same way? What does that look like to start putting that in place, right? Um, and that can help shape our consciousness. And what matters most is the way we conduct ourselves, right? To keep our egos in check. So I'm not now fighting for Palestine to have the biggest account. I'm not now fighting this letter so I got the best take. So everybody listens to me and I show that I've got 5 people off of the list or whatever it is.
Yeah.
How do we constantly come back to a position of like humility, of honest conduct, of committed conduct, right? These are questions that I think we also have to ask ourselves today. And I think these are questions that we can start to get answers to, or not answers to, but that we can usefully start to work out by reading, again, somebody like Khamenei, because this is something he's always thinking about, right? There's revolution, but then there's the revolutionary. Ghassan Kanafani spoke about this, that the Palestinian question is also about the constitution, the creation of the Palestinian. What sort of human being is being forged? Through what type of conduct? We have to ask this also, like of ourselves, as we see our setbacks, our failures, and how we try to renew things in moments like this.
Yeah, I mean, again, this might not seem like if it fits the conversation, but I think it does because when you really do an investigation as to how we get to a myth like Iran being imperialist, these are the logics that produce it. It's not simply just the CIA strong arming or because something another comrade said once to me, I quoted him before, he said co-optation is a self-critique. And I always think about that, like sometimes co-optation
Mhm.
is not always inevitable. It's your own weaknesses that are exploited and you need
Yeah,
to review those weaknesses, right? So it doesn't always have to go that direction. But if you make certain decisions and you put yourself in certain situations, it's more inevitable. But it's a self-critique because like there's something that is being captured that appeals to people where you're able to capture that and steer it in a different direction. And then so
yeah,
we have to ask ourselves, what is that thing that they're able to capture where we can go from we want, sovereignty to we just want representation? How does that get
yeah,
mixed up?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's something we have to ask ourselves about that. Or otherwise, like it's going to keep happening, and we can, that's when people criticize the CIA blaming from that perspective. I think they have a point. Like not that they don't do terrible things, but in terms of there's
Right.
never a reflection on like what are we doing that allows the CIA or the FBI or whatever alphabet organization to totally mess our shit up. Like
Mhm.
what are we doing that opens the door
Right.
for that? Like,
Oh, brilliant.
it's not victimhood, it's not victim blaming, it's just to say there is something that they are
No.
assessing when they're attacking you
Yeah,
that you need
yeah,
to be reflective of. Like that is a real question, like
yeah,
that's in the countries I think we can learn from Iran, we can
yeah,
learn from these because they have to ask themselves those questions because it's not an abstract thing. Like, no, Mossad was in our country,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
I mean, Sinwar, look,
Yeah.
Sinwar, in the thread, I mentioned this when I was like, okay, look, don't feel too bad. Leave these signatories and read the resistance now. Okay, go to them and you will encounter what imperialism actually is and what anti-imperialism actually is. So that, to your point exactly, this point when you're saying, okay, like, of course we need to we should be aware of CIA interventions and Mossad interventions. But then that should reflect back to us how to strengthen our character and our
Mhm.
conduct in our spaces. So we are less susceptible to this. So the person who I mentioned that people should read is Yahya Sinwar. Okay, so Sinwar writes a novel. I think the title is The Thorn in the Carnation or Thorns and Carnations or something, right? Like the Thorn in the Carnation. It's like banned from TV type of stuff in the West, right? Like
Mhm.
I don't know what the legislation stuff around it is, but I can understand why Western leaders would fear this. So what do I write in in the thread very briefly, but what I'm trying to get to, what is Sinwar concerned with? He's concerned with what you're talking about. He's saying Palestinians in Gaza will and Palestine, historic Palestine, there will never be even a possibility of liberation. We can't even fight until we address the question of collaboration.
Mm.
This is what he says first. The issue is how do we address on our own? And it's getting to what you're saying, right? He's not only saying we need to be hard on collaborators, although he is saying, like Sinwar was unforgiving to collaborators, as you have to be. Like, what are you supposed to do if you have collaborators in your midst? You can't allow even a slight opening for that. But there's a social process I think you're pointing to in terms of how you both create a social space and create a social subject, right? And create what Kanafani will say a revolutionary subject. And Sinwar is saying to do so, we need to try to limit dependency as much as possible structurally. So how do you get collaborators? You get collaborators maybe through economic dependency, but also by getting people to act in ways that might not be the most righteous or like to act in ways where they can say, oh, you want people to know this? No, you can blackmail people, for example, right?
Hmm.
So you want people to conduct themselves in principled, like committed, courageous ways. So it was the Islamic movement in Gaza, as Sinwar is discussing. He's saying they're being outflanked by the left often on campuses and whatnot, right? But where the Islamic movement really establishes itself is in the conduct and character of its members over time, right? How they continually prioritize principles, right, over their own self-interests, right? How they conduct themselves in such a way that limits the space available for the Mossad to find collaborators. Okay, and we know this is obviously still present in Gaza. We see the militias. We know that these things are there because of the condition of desperation that's there. But I think to your point, that's exactly right. That's why we should engage with the political theory of Yahya Sinwar, right? Like we can learn a lot from it as to how do you develop your character and your conduct so it doesn't easily get taken by the rewards of the genocidaires. They're going to offer you trinkets. They can offer you a lot, but they can't offer you your liberation.
No.
And I end that thread with this point. By opening ourselves up to the epistemology of the resistance, we can maybe become free enough that we can free ourselves from being part of genocidal imperialist societies, one way or the other.
I think that's a good way to close. The other questions I'll just ask you off air.
Sure.
But
No worries.
but no, I think that's a great way to close. Again, I think um, you know, it's important to do that the analysis we did at the beginning or that you did primarily in terms of laying out the world systems and understanding, the relationships between the core and the periphery and the drain of value and all those things are important. Like we need to frame it in that sense, but we also do need to think about, at the end of the day, this does come down to the scale of human beings and how we're living
Mhm.
it. And it's not an individual thing, but it's like how are we organizing ourselves? And the way we organize ourselves is how how you get, at least for the project of this show, is how often you get these myths when we go back over them, when we research them.
Right.
There's a certain way that people have been organized that produces a faulty idea about reality over and over and over and over again. It doesn't really matter what the myth is. I'm talking about in terms of these more bigger geopolitical, social, cultural myths. Like you're always getting these ways that people have been organized to accept some bullshit, that doesn't actually hold up, and you have to reorientate yourself to even see like this is not consistent with reality, So we grow up on terrorist shows and we grow up on terrorist movies and we grow up on all of that, and then you see that, and even if you hate that, then you're so
Yeah.
far that direction that if somebody tries to correct for it, it still denies sovereignty. It's just going to be okay, Muslims are human beings. Wow, it's such
Mhm.
a profound
Yeah.
statement, you
Exactly.
know. So
Exactly.
it's like
Yeah.
they're not all terrorists or like
Yeah.
so it
You
just
did them a huge
positions you.
favor. You did them a huge favor by calling them human beings.
Yeah, yeah. Like but we do this over and over again because we get dragged to some really more extreme propaganda, and then we think we're correcting it by still like, but we're still latching ourselves onto that logic. So it's like, yeah, Muslims are human beings. We should recognize that. No one is denying it, but it's like that kind of abstract liberal notion doesn't like really break down the logics that still produce the letter and more broadly produces war, imperialism, etc. So I think that, these deeper questions often don't get asked when we're having these conversations. We usually are more talking about the structure, but the way we conduct ourselves and the way we move is important. And I think we need to be thinking more deeply about that. So appreciate you for raising that, and having the willingness to look past what's easily a dunking moment. When people put out a shitty letter.
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, and thank you for letting me come on and having the conversation. It was good.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, peace out.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe.